This What's Working with Cam Marston podcast is brought to you by Stella Artois Beer.
What's Working with Cam Marston is brought to you by Stella Artois Beer. Stella Artois is a perfect beer for celebration. Nothing caps off a big sale, hitting your incentive goals, or a profitable quarter like a round of Stellas. Brewed first in 1708 as a special Christmas brew, today Stella is a gift for everyone to enjoy year-round. Stella Artois. Find it wherever fine beer is sold.
Let's do this. Welcome to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. What's Working is the show designed to bring you the workplace, the workforce, and the marketplace trends shaping the workplace, the workforce, and the marketplace around you. I find guests that are going to knock your socks off, quite frankly, because of the insights that they have into their work world, with the hopes that some of their insights will make you and me a little bit better at whatever it is we do. And the reason I'm so excited about this episode today is in my hands, I hold one of the books that's had one of the greatest impacts on me in a long, long time. Believe it or not, this book has no pictures. That's right. It's called The Great Work of Your Life by Stephen Cope. I heard Stephen interviewed on a podcast called The Art of Manliness, and I listened to it and was just taken with it. And I listened to that podcast to the end, and it had the same impact. And then I said, well, gosh, if I've listened to the podcast twice and I like this guy so much, maybe I should buy the book. So I bought the book. And I read the introduction and thought, oh, well, this will be kind of nice as I kind of begin reading the introduction. I've got it open on my lap. And I closed the book, I stood up, and I went to find a highlighter after having started the introduction and came back and started working through the book with a highlighter or a pencil to make sure the lines that leapt out to me, I kept forever. And this book has been marked up. It's got bookmarks all in it. It's just one of the more instrumental reads I've had in my life because, and I've said this before on this show, I'm in my mid-50s. And there are a lot of folks out there about my age, friends of mine, friends of yours and mine, and you know them, who are changing jobs, who are looking for something to fulfill the final chapter of their work life, who say, I've got about 15 more years left of this work gig, and I want to do something that's a little bit more meaningful, a little bit more purposeful. I've slayed the dragon. That's my name for it. I've slayed the dragon. I've done this job, and I've done it well. What's next? I want to learn something. I want to conquer something. And not only that, I want to conquer something that's meaningful to me. Not something that just puts the bread on the table, though that's important. Not something that just helps the team and keeps the lights on, though that's important. But something that's meaningful to me. And I'll be honest with you, this radio show, what you're listening to right now, this podcast/radio show was born out of that question of what would I do if I could do more of what I want to do versus what I have to do. And it landed me here. I wonder if I could do this radio show. And it's been great. Stephen Cope really stimulated this thinking in my mind because I'm not sure this is the final thing for me. And I'm loving it, but I really was stimulated by what Stephen said. All right. I emailed him, found his website. Would you be on my radio show? I said in a weepy voice, all through keyboard, of course, weepy writing. And he replied, yes. And today is the day. I've been excited all day. Really have been excited all day. When we get back, I'm going to have Stephen Cope on the line with me, and I'm going to walk him through this book and ask him more thoughtful questions that the book has led me to. And I just can't wait. Now, segue. If there's anybody out there who, in my opinion, through people I've interacted with, are doing what they were born to do, perhaps, it's the professionals over at Sandifer Wealth Management. You've heard me talk about them. Jamie Sandifer and Mark Salyers are as good and as decent and kind and honest and working with people like you and me to help them create a future, perhaps that they've planned or perhaps even better than they've planned. If you're somebody that's looking for help or want to give your team a 401k to help them retire, or you're going to retire soon and you've got a 401k balance that you're going to take with you, reach out to them. Talk to them, meet them, spend time with them. Let them ask you some questions to help you decide what your future is going to look like. Again, Mark Salyers and Jamie Sandifer at Sandifer Wealth Management. Find them online. Give them a call. When we come back, I'll have on the line with me, Stephen Cope.
At Spring Hill Toyota, it's just that easy. From our 3-day exchange to free car washes, the benefits of the Spring Hill Advantage make the choice easy to see. We make it easy to own. Every vehicle comes with Toyota Care, plus our no-cost maintenance plan with free tire rotations and oil changes for 4 years. Get peace of mind with free roadside assistance 24/7. And don't forget, it's easy to buy your car 100% online. Visit SpringHillToyota.com today. It's just that easy.
I'm on the line with Stephen Cope. Of the nearly 200 podcasts and radio broadcasts I've done, this is one of the ones that I've looked most forward to because of the impact of this book that I'm holding in my left hand called The Great Work of Your Life has had on me, has had on my wife, has had on the 6 or 7 friends that I've given a copy of this book to. It's extraordinary, and it's an honor to be on the phone with you, Stephen. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome to What's Working.
Thanks, Cam. I'm so glad to be with you.
Your book is really timeless in a sense, and it also quotes a timeless document that I want to get into momentarily. But before, tell me a little bit about yourself. Let's give our listeners who aren't familiar with you some perspective. Tell us about Stephen Cope.
Sure. Well, I have for 30 years, I've been the senior scholar in residence at the largest yoga center in America and possibly the world, Kripalu Center. We see about 50,000 people a year in our yoga and meditation programs. And I got interested in yoga and meditation when I was in graduate school for psychology and realized that the ancient Eastern traditions had made enormous strides in understanding depth psychology. And so I got very interested in exploring that. Most of my career has been spent looking at the important documents and treatises of yoga and Buddhism and translating them or commenting them on a way that makes them useful to mainstream American folk. So the book that we're going to talk about, I think, was my 4th book. And I'm just now finishing my 6th.
Yeah, you keep going.
And that's what I've been up to.
We want to hear about the 6th book. I am very curious about the 6th book, but the great work of your life. When you and I traded emails about you being on this show, I shared with you, if I recall correctly, one of the things that I'm seeing. So let me, Stephen, introduce you to my audience real quick.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is this radio show and this podcast targets workplace leaders, influencers, managers, not exclusively, but these are the people that tend to tune in for the show because they're looking for the trends that are, and I try to talk to my guests about trends in their business so that my listeners will understand those trends and perhaps can influence their own business by understanding the way trends are influencing others out there. Yeah. So my listeners are often 45 years old and older, not exclusively, but 45 years old and older. So let's take it to what I'm seeing in my world these days. I'm in my early to mid 50s, and many of my peers and colleagues in kind of hushed tones when we're having a beer are saying, man, I'm kind of tired of this. And they're referring to their job, their work. I'm no longer inspired by it. It's just the thought of doing this for 15 more years to retirement is just overwhelming. But I don't know what else I'd want to do. And I was in that situation, and it led to the birth of this show as well as many other things when I asked that question. Talk to me, if you will, about your understanding of this mid-career person. It's mentioned in the book, and what their challenges may be, and then we'll get into the text.
Sure. Well, we have a misapprehension in this culture that you're supposed to have one career and follow it straight through from graduate school or whatever until retirement. And that's not actually the way people's psyches and souls work. Very often we start out life, in my experience, with a certain a certain task that we need to do to complete our sense of self and our psyches and our souls, and we complete those. And so at that point, we come to the end of what in the Eastern traditions they call a dharma, or a calling, a sacred calling, and it's time to move on to the next thing. So very often the next thing will be built upon the basis of what we've done earlier in life, but we're not particularly taught in our culture to attune to that deep soul longing for the next thing. And I've noticed that the book that we're talking about today has been so popular because people really want to tune into and find tools to understand how to work with that deep inner calling. So I'm not surprised to hear what you say about your clients and yourself.
Yeah. So what is Dharma? Let's begin here. Define Dharma. And I also want to get into how to find it.
Sure. So Dharma is one of those great many-layered Sanskrit words that often means truth or path or teaching. But in the text that I'm working with, which is the ancient Bhagavad Gita, one of the most important texts in Eastern literature, the word Dharma always means sacred calling or vocation or true calling. The idea is that there is deeply planted in our souls an understanding of the tasks that we need to accomplish in this lifetime to feel like we've completely fulfilled ourselves. And the text that you and I are going to be talking about, the Bhagavad Gita, is a conversation between a mere mortal like us, and a neurotic one at that, and God, or in this case, Krishna, who is an avatar of God, or an earthly human emanation of God. And they talk through an entire night about this question of Dharma and how you know your Dharma and what it is and how you recognize it. And so that's what the book is about.
So there are people listening who have been in and I'm just going to pick something, the banking industry for 15 years,
right,
for 20 years. And they're saying, well, is banking my Dharma? As I understand the script, a profession is not a Dharma. It is what you do within the profession. So let's get into how people can go about identifying what their Dharma is. Is there, and this is typical of Western solutions, we're trying to add enlightenment principles to it. There's got to be a checklist of 1 through 8 that helps you identify your Dharma, or there's got to be a workshop that I can go to that is a Dharma-focused workshop. Help people understand how they know when they found it and what they can do to find it.
Absolutely. Well, I've discovered in working with this intensively over the last 30 years that there are 3 different areas that are important hunting grounds for Dharma. The first one is this: what is it that's lighting you up at this point in your life? That is, what are you fascinated by? What are you drawn to? And this is a very visceral experience of attraction. It may be way outside the field that you've studied, or it may seem completely counterintuitive. But when we're on the hunt for Dharma, we have to really pay attention to these visceral attractions that we have. And so I call this what lights you up. So the very first thing to pay attention to is what lights you up. And in workshops, I have people make lists of these, and I counsel them not to censor their list. In other words, we all have an idea of what should be on our list, what we should be looking for. But if you do it that way, you may miss something crucial about what's really lighting you up. So that's the first, what I call hunting ground for Dharma. The second one is a very different hunting ground, and this is, what is the duty that you feel called to most profoundly at this point in life? And by duty, I mean not what is imposed by other people on you, but what is it in your life that if you do not do, you will have a profound sense of self-betrayal. That is, if you get to the end of your life and you've not done this, you will feel a sense of having let yourself down, of self-betrayal. So what is the duty that you feel called to, not by external forces, but by your own soul? This can be very different than lit up, but they can also overlap. Mm-hmm. So first of all, what's lighting you up? Second of all, explore these duties. And third, the third area that's very productive in terms of Dharma is challenges and difficulties. Very often, challenges and difficulties. So illness, divorce, relationship problems of all kinds. Very often these difficulties can have within them the seed of something that's calling you forth into your future. So lit up, duty, and difficulty. Those are the three most productive areas that I always ask people to look into. So let's define, let me clarify something here, because one of the notes that I've underlined in your book is that once you've found your Dharma, it doesn't mean that everything gets easy after that. There's still going to be challenges. There's still going to be difficulties. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about in identifying the Dharma, some of the difficulties in your life that may be pointing at something. Am I getting that right? That's exactly right. So, for example, I use the example of Marion Woodman, who's the most important feminist Jungian analyst in the 20th century. And she was rolling along in life until she encountered bone cancer. And she decided that one option was to decide that she was going to take the bone cancer and the fight with it and the struggle with it as her Dharma. She was going to take it on as her calling, because the doctors had said she was fated to die quite quickly. Well, she took it on as her calling. She closed her practice. She brought everything she had to the challenge. And of course, she survived. She wrote a brilliant book called Bone, in which she describes how she took it on and how she succeeded and what it brought her spiritually. Because as you say, difficult moments, we don't invite them in. We don't love them, but very often they're good for the soul. And so if you take it at that level, you're working with Dharma. So many religious texts from across the various historic religions address suffering and how we can't escape it. But we can be changed by it. When we come back, Stephen, I want to talk about something that I noticed in the book that I highlighted, which is Dharma has something to do with the times that you're in, that they're temporal purposes. And well, let's get into that when we get back. Folks, I'm on the line with Stephen Cope. His book is The Great Work of Your Life. The subtitle, A Guide for the Journey to Your True Calling. I heard him on a podcast. I bought his book. I then started going back through the book and highlighting it, and I've bought a bunch for other people. This is good stuff and a proud moment for me. We'll be right back.
I'm Paul Lewis, General Manager of Roy Lewis Construction. Many of our commercial buildings you drive by daily on both sides of the bay are the fruits of our client relationship since our beginning in the early 80s. It is our mission to bring value to our clients, from retrofits to ground-up construction and everything in between. We have more advocates than any of our competitors who have been in business twice as long. Same with repeat business, same with referrals. Find us online at roylewisconstruction.com and let's talk about your next commercial project.
With Stephen Cope. Stephen, I neglected to even ask where you are sitting as we're talking right now. Where are you headquartered?
I'm actually sitting in my office in Albany, New York.
In Albany, New York.
Right. So I am currently the senior scholar in residence at Kripalu Center, which is the largest yoga and meditation center in America.
Yeah.
And it's about 50 minutes away, but I live here in Albany and work here.
Okay. I knew you were up east somewhere. I didn't know exactly where. Let's get back into this content. And that is one of the things your book says, and I think one of the things that Krishna says, perhaps in the Bhagavad Gita. I've not read that text. I've not read the Gita, but I've read what I can of it through your book. Anyway, that your Dharma has something to do with the times that you're in. If you could expand on that, please.
Absolutely. So I wrote a chapter called Listen to the Call of the Times, in which I examine the life of one of the greatest American poets, Walt Whitman. And this is a perfect example of Dharma's relationship to the times. So Whitman, of course, just before the Civil War, had published his brilliant poem, Leaves of Grass. He was very popular and famous. Emerson had just declared him a genius. And he was riding high on that Dharma of poetry. And along comes the Civil War. And Whitman's brother, George, became a soldier in the Civil War and was badly wounded. And Whitman went to the Civil War hospitals to find George. He finally did find him. But in the process, he found this enormous amount of suffering. All of these soldiers in these horrible hospitals in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. And he decided, after some deliberation, that he felt called to be what he called a soldier's missionary. So here he is in the midst of a brilliant career. He sees this door opening into this calling, into this kind of mystical calling of being a missionary to these soldiers who are dying. And he takes that on as his new Dharma. He goes from bed to bed. He writes letters home for the soldiers. He reads them poetry and he reads from novels. He ministers to the soldiers. This is a complete shift, but it's his response to the profound call of the times. And when the times are shifting so profoundly, these doors open that had not previously been opened. And Whitman, to his credit, saw that, was flexible enough to completely shift his career. And he spent the Civil War in war hospitals. And then, of course, he combined those two careers by writing the most brilliant poetry out of the Civil War that he published after the Civil War. And he became kind of the bard of the Civil War, writing this beautiful poetry about it.
Wasn't he? Didn't he write Captain, Oh Captain, My Captain?
He did. Which of course is of course that's about Abraham Lincoln and the death of Lincoln. And he was present in Washington when Lincoln's body came back. He became the observer, the witness, if you will, of the suffering of the war. And it was a sacrificial calling, by the way, because he became ill himself, hanging out in those hospitals. He never really fully recovered, but it was the sacrifice he felt called on to make.
So the couple things stand out. Number one, people's Dharma can change. Walt Whitman is a person whose Dharma was changed from being the poet to then going into the hospitals and then perhaps returning as the poet at the end of the war. And I think that's a good message for us. I think there's a cultural bias in our society that I am meant to do one thing, and that is the one thing that I'll do my entire life. What you're telling me is, hey, sometimes that Dharma may dry up and it's time to re-examine things.
That's exactly right, Cam. There are a lot of myths about this idea of Dharma, and one of them is that we have one calling in this lifetime, and that's not true. We have multiple callings. They may come one after the other, or we can have more than one Dharma at the same time. But certainly they change. That's one of the big myths. The other myth about Dharma, of course, is what I call the romance of Dharma, which is the idea that our Dharma must inevitably be extremely romantic and dramatic. So in order to find your Dharma, you have to leave your job selling insurance and move to Paris and paint.
Yes.
And, that does happen sometimes, but that's not really what Dharma is about.
I'm going to read the people you profile in the book here, and then I got a question to follow it. You profiled Jane Goodall, which I enjoyed, Thoreau, Whitman, who we just talked about, Robert Frost, Susan B. Anthony. Pronounce C-O-R-O-T for me. I know it's French.
Corot. Camille Corot. Yep.
You've profiled John Keats, Marion Woodman, who you just spoke about, Beethoven, Harriet Tubman, and Gandhi. Now, with the exception of Woodman, most people listening have likely heard of the people that I've listed here. And it could lead to the conclusion that once you've found your Dharma, fame will follow. Talk to me about that.
That is an interesting response that I sometimes get. And the interesting fact is most of those people actually were never famous during their own lives. So Thoreau, for example, was widely considered a loser. And Thoreau, most of his friends and neighbors in small town Concord thought that the guy was a freak and a loser, and he'd kind of lived on the outskirts of society. But there he was in his cabin in Walden Pond, writing his brilliant essay on civil disobedience, writing the book Walden, which became one of the most important in American literature. So some of these people became famous afterwards as a result of doing their Dharma, but fame has absolutely nothing to do with Dharma. In fact, the Buddha said fame is the deadliest poison because we get attracted to it, and it derails us from our calling. So it's not a goal. It may be a byproduct of doing your Dharma, but it's not something you want to cling to. And in our culture, it's very unfortunate that so many people are famous for no other reason than that they're famous.
Yeah.
That's not something to cling to, as I said.
There is the assumption, I think, that the fame or monetary reward will be an indicator that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, that I will achieve success through one of these two barometers that are widely celebrated in our Western society of fame and money. I'll know what I'm supposed to be doing because the money will be easy at that point. Address that for me.
Yeah, that's a siren song, Cam. That's a detour. And the fact is that my experience is most people who actually follow their authentic inner calling and listen to, what Thoreau called the distant drummer, that is that subtle inner voice that guides you. Most people who do that end up being successful in their own way, whether it's money or fame or mostly just profound personal fulfillment. So I'm a great example. Believe it or not, one does not make any money writing books. However good the books are, there are like 12 people in America who actually make money writing books. But for me, it's a calling. It's what I do. It's what I love to do. My grandfather was a writer. My mother was a poet. It's in my blood. I love it. It provides me with a profound sense of fulfillment. And there's enough money. There's enough money to live on. How much do you really need? So I really suggest that people go for authentic fulfillment rather than dollar signs.
The siren song, I love the way you described that. Off the top of your head, do you have an example of somebody who thought they had identified their Dharma and ultimately realized later on, no, that's not it. There's probably everybody listening could apply to this. But I'm wondering if there's a story that you know that we could all relate to.
I do. And actually, I talked about this in the book. I think you may remember the minister that I talked about who had a vague sense as a young man that he was called to the priesthood, right? And so he went through seminary, he became a priest, and yet he never felt really like he was inhabiting his real self in that role. And finally, he realized that his real calling was in music. And so he was constantly, this is where lit up comes in. Yeah. He was constantly lit up and fascinated by the choir and the music and the organ. And it turns out that was actually what was drawing him to the church. It was his love of music. So he got in the kind of in the right general church, but wrong pew, if you'll pardon the bad analogy. He was in the ballpark, but he wasn't in his right seat. So he made a mid-career shift. And the lesson here is that very often the work of discernment of Dharma is not going to take you into a completely different world, but somewhere else in the world you're already in that's more precisely aimed at your particular love and passion and Dharma. So that was the case with the priest. Yeah. He was in the right church, but he was in the wrong pew.
Love the analogy. Love the analogy. Yeah. I'm on the line with Stephen Cope. Folks, I can't tell you enough about his book, The Great Work of Your Life. We're going to go to break. Stephen, here's the question I've got queued up after break. And it's read something like this in your book. I couldn't find it as I was preparing, so I just wrote it from memory. When we have nothing to focus on, we've not found our Dharma. Instead, we focus on ourselves. But we are too small to be the subject of our own Dharma. Sound right?
That's right.
Let's talk about this when we get back from break. Stephen Cope, this is What's Working. I'm Cam Marston.
At Spring Hill Toyota, it's just that easy. From our 3-day exchange to free car washes, the benefits of the Spring Hill Advantage make the choice easy to see. We make it easy to own. Every vehicle comes with Toyota Care, plus our no-cost maintenance plan with free tire rotations and oil changes for 4 years. Get peace of mind with free roadside assistance 24/7. And don't forget, it's easy to buy your car 100% online. Visit SpringHillToyota.com today. It's just that easy.
Hey, this is Cam. Thanks for listening, and I hope you're really enjoying the podcast. Do me a favor and search for Cam Marston on your social media outlets and like us or follow us or whatever is the right thing to do. Also, if you know others who'd benefit from the podcast, please forward it on to them and encourage them to listen. If you're so inclined, we'd love your rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Those ratings matter. Finally, don't be a stranger. Email me with your comments, your feedback, your thoughts, your show ideas, whatever. Cam, C-A-M, at cammarston.com. I'd love to hear from you. Again, thank you very much for listening. Now, back to the show. Just prior to the break, I asked Stephen, told Stephen, queued him up for this question. When we have nothing to focus on, we tend to focus on ourselves and treat ourselves like we're our own Dharma. However, we are not big enough. Each of us individually are not big enough. We're too small to be our own Dharma, and our focus tends to, this is my word, Stephen, not yours, ruin us. Talk to me about people that focus on themselves and think of themselves as their purpose.
Yeah, well, this unfortunately is one of the great distortions of our culture, Cam. The completely obsessive interest in ourselves, me, mine, my great career, my exalted books, whatever. And so it's a profound limitation. This is why we haven't talked about this yet, but in the Bhagavad Gita, there are basically 4 pillars of the path.
Yeah.
The first one is to discern your Dharma, which we've mostly been talking about. The second one is to do it full out, that is to bring everything you've got to it. The third one is to let go of the outcome. That's a tricky one. But the fourth one is to turn it over to God. And by that, one can say, turn it over to God or turn it over to something bigger than yourself. Because if you become the obsessive object of your world will only get smaller and smaller. Whereas if you devote yourself to a bigger task, to the world, this is where Whitman had that beautiful calling, but it was a sacrificial calling, but it stretched him to meet the needs and understand the needs and the dilemmas of his time. And paradoxically, of course, it finally improved his poetry because his poetry after the war was brilliant. So turn this whole project over to something bigger than yourself, even if that's, so for example, I work for a large organization. We have 500 employees. We're a magnificent organization with our headquarters in the Berkshires of Massachusetts. One could say, I've turned part of my life and my work over to the work of this organization that I believe in. And that has stretched me. That has put me in positions of discomfort and out of my comfort zone. But it's been great for the soul. And so I highly recommend that people don't get caught up in, again, the siren song of the self, I, me, mine.
You've mentioned a number of things here that make me want to ask you about parallels in other faiths. So I introduced you to my audience, and let me introduce you to my part of the world. While the podcast is listened to all over the world, there are the richest listener base I have is here in the Deep South. In the Deep South, it's a fairly conservative part of the world, and there's often some suspicion about any sort of faith that is not Christian-based. Mm-hmm. The Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, I would suspect many of my listeners may have heard this before, but like me, they're not very familiar with it, and they may be a bit turned off by giving so much homage to a book from a different faith. Talk to me about the parallels between what's in the Bhagavad Gita and what the parallels are in Christianity.
So first of all, the Bhagavad Gita is recognized as one of the most important spiritual texts in world literature. Many of us studied it in college and took it as an item of kind of scholarly interest. But if you dig down into the guts of this brilliant treatise, 18 chapters long, not long, it's really about our relationship with God and God's will. You could actually translate Dharma into the language of Christianity, and it would come out as God's will. So practically the very first thing that Krishna, who, remember, Krishna is an avatar of God. Just as Christ was an earthly manifestation of God, so is Krishna. And there are many parallels. And basically at the beginning of the book, Krishna says, look, the first thing you have to do, he says this to Arjuna, who's this great warrior who's struggling with his Dharma. He says, the first thing you have to do is take refuge in me. Take refuge in God, right? Take refuge in my abiding care and in my will. And if you're not guiding your life along the principle of being in alignment with God's will for you, says Krishna to Arjuna, you're going to screw up. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to miss your Dharma altogether. So the whole book is actually organized around God. It's essentially, and this was a model in ancient India to have the great religious treatises were conversations between a mortal like us and an incarnation of God like Krishna.
So it's what timeline was the Bhagavad Gita written?
The Gita was written around 300 BCE, before the Common Era, before Christ.
Right. So it predates Christ's life on Earth.
It predates Christ by 300 years, yes.
And and many people have in our modern times found the Gita and been influenced by it. Do you see so we talked about parallels between the Gita and Christianity. Are you knowledgeable enough about other religions outside those two where there may be additional parallels?
Oh, there are parallels everywhere. So first of all, in Buddhism. So, of course, Buddhism is not does not believe in a deity per se, but the understanding in the Gita of listening to the still small voice, listening to the inner voice, is almost identical to Buddhism's listening to awake mind or enlightened mind. The notion here is that all of us have, at the core of the self, an awake mind. All of us have this still small voice that we listen to, and if we don't listen to, it's at our own peril. So Christianity, Buddhism, in terms of the Jewish faith, a lot of parallels there, particularly in the community aspect. So basically, the Bhagavad Gita says there is no such thing as authentic personal fulfillment apart from the common good. That is to say, once you find your Dharma, you will notice that inevitably, as you begin to master your Dharma, you notice that you're also contributing to the good of the world, to the common good, to the good of all people. That's a very central notion in the Jewish faith, and it's absolutely central to the Bhagavad Gita too. And Whitman's story is a perfect example of that. My own story, for example, is that so I'm a writer, but as I dive more and more deeply into my Dharma, I find that inevitably I want to write about the big things that are challenging the world right now. That is, the world at any given time, in Whitman's time it was the Civil War, at any given time is going through difficulty. And in this particular book, in the Bhagavad Gita, this warrior, Arjuna, is called to the biggest battle of the era. It's the Battle of Kurukshetra. The whole book takes place on the night before the battle. But it's important to notice that Arjuna, in finding his Dharma, finds it in the central struggle of the age.
Stephen, so many questions. Let me interrupt the pacing of what we're doing here to ask a favor. First, I want to hear about the book because we're coming up on the end of the segment. I want to hear about the new book and what we can expect. And second, can I ask if you'd be willing to, after this segment, the radio show wraps up, but we can continue the podcast. So can I ask you to stay on the line for a little bit and let's explore a couple of these ideas for the podcast?
Yes, I'd be delighted, Cam.
Tell me about the upcoming book, what you've just been working on.
Well, we just kind of segued into that because the new book, Cam, was written. It's called the Dharma of Difficult Times. And the truth is that however placid we thought our lives were prior to COVID, they've all been profoundly disrupted. The whole world is disrupted in a way that touches all of our lives. And so I wanted to dig back into the Gita and find the wisdom on this. And so I explore something called the disorienting dilemma, which is the kinds of dilemmas that we all face when we have to make choices about what our duty is in the world right now. And so we're all asking the question, okay, the world is in many ways in shambles right now. Our political dialogue's in shambles. Our planet itself is in shambles. There's all this animosity and hatred going on between people. The question arises, what is my duty in the face of all of this? And so I actually examine 8 additional lives in addition to the 11 that I did in the first book, each of whom faced a difficult moment in their culture. And we look at the principles from the Gita about determining what's your duty? What's your duty, Cam, in the midst of the upheavals that we're living in? What's my duty? Well, I figured my duty was to write about it. So that's what I've done.
Tell me, repeat the title of this new book again, please.
Yeah, it's called The Dharma in Difficult Times.
And when can we expect it available?
That will be available in December when it's on now. Yeah.
Good for you. That's pumping it out, man.
Yeah.
Well, let's close the segment. Folks, we are going to continue this conversation. And Stephen, I'm going to tell you what I think my duty is in these difficult times and what I've done and get your feedback on it. Not looking for your blessing because I'm not sure that's anybody's job. It's with me and my maker, but I'll tell you my story. Folks, the book that generated this interest in Stephen and his work is called The Great Work of Your Life. It sits next to me as I say this. Author is Stephen Cope, C-O-P-E. It has had a profound influence on me. I hope you'll go find it. Stephen, thank you. We'll continue this in the podcast form momentarily.
Thank you, Cam. My pleasure.
All right, folks. Come back in a moment with final comments. You're listening to What's Working.
At Roy Lewis Construction, we're in the business of adding value. Whether it's working with you to meet your unique business needs or making investments in our community in lasting ways, providing unparalleled value and quality in every commercial construction project. When planning your next commercial project, reach out to Roy Lewis Construction. We'll pair you with a designer that best suits your project needs and work with that designer to balance the best architectural outcome with the best budget outcome. Find us online at roylewisconstruction.com, building legacies one relationship at a time.
Hey, this is Chuck Thus. When I'm not hosting chart-topping podcast Warriors Unmasked or coaching athletes to show up as the best version of themselves, I'm listening to What's Working with Cam Marston. Now back to the show.
It goes without saying that I hope you'll go find the podcast and listen to it or download it or do whatever you have to do to hear the conversation Stephen and I had once the studio mics were off. The guy is generous with his knowledge. And as you can tell by the excitement in my voice and the questions that I asked him, my primary goal for getting him on the show was entirely personal. Yeah, there was, I hope you benefited. I hope the listener, you found something valuable to what he said. But when I called him and said, hey, would you be on the show? What was going in the back of my mind is I have some questions that I hope you can answer that will tell me a little bit more about me. And there's something about hearing the truth, man, the truth, that you feel it more than you just hear it. And I felt that reading his book. I felt that in my conversation with him. It's his wisdom in discerning through that Hindu text. Now, there's something I never thought I'd ever say, is the influence of a Hindu text on me. Now, there are plenty of you listening out there that have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to purpose and meaning and all that. You got a good job. You're pleased with your gig, and you're listening to this, if you haven't changed the channel, and you're rubbing your chin and you're shaking your head going, I don't know. This guy's lost his mind. This Marston fella, he had some credibility up till today. There are plenty of you out there, though, that know exactly what I'm talking about. Know exactly. And you're looking at the next 15, 20 years of your career, of your work life going, this needs to not just make money, but it needs to mean something. And that's what Stephen's helped me with. And I'm not exactly clear on it all, but he's helping me with it. And it has been refreshing. So hope you enjoyed it. Go listen to the podcast, what he and I get into further. Here's the website for the podcast, what'sworkingcam.com. Again, what'sworkingcam.com. You'll find this show as well as all the others. The podcast that I first heard Stephen on is called The Art of Manliness, and you can search for his name in that panel. It's a strange sounding podcast, but it's really very good. All right, let's wrap it up. Let's thank the people that need to be thanked. John Thompson with Ion Digital produces the show. Every time I say that is the day that he can't spend on his boat because he's in there working in his studio, taking out my ands, my ums, and my you-knows. He's precious to the success of the show. John, thank you for your work. I want to remind everybody about the upcoming, and this may be premature to talk about it, November 4th, Community Foundation of South Alabama is the location for a succession planning workshop that I am putting on with 3 other partners. Again, November 4th. The date or the time is 4. Content starts at 4:30. It'll go for about an hour. There'll be a reception following with a luau and hula theme. I'm kidding about that. We'll be talking about mentally preparing yourself for succession planning. Those of you that are about to leave the workplace, how to get your mind around it. That'll be my role. Jamie Sandifer and Mark Salyers will be talking about the financial components of succession planning. Rick Miller, who is a succession planning coach, amongst other things, will be talking about how he coaches people through the process. I hope you'll join us. Email me, Cam, C-A-M, at cammarston.com, and I'll put your name on the RSVP list and give you any other information you want. Have a good week, everybody. We'll have another show next week. Stephen, we're now in podcast-only format, which means that the FCC does not have its heavy thumb on what we say or do, though I don't think it's going to be anything that would get blocked by the FCC. But it allows us to go into a little bit deeper things. And there's a couple notes that I have here that we were unable to get into the radio portion of this. And I'd love to discuss the difference between grasping and aspirations. There's some subtleties there that I found just magical as I read them. And they resonated with me. And then perhaps I can tell you what my reaction to these times is and the story that goes behind it. But let's go first with aspirations and grasping, because I feel like, I'll show you my cards real quick. So much of my career thus far has been centered on grasping, what I want next. And what and I see it as kind of a crazed, hungry man grasping at everything. Yeah. But there is a subtle, but there's a profound difference. It's not subtle between grasping and aspiration. Would you go into that for me, please?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad you picked that up, Cam. Not everybody gets that from the book, but it's absolutely a central principle. And the notion in all of the Eastern contemplative traditions is that grasping is the root of suffering. Grasping, craving, clinging, holding on. And there are two types of grasping. One is reaching for something that you don't have, but that you hunger for. This is driven by, we know this is driven by the most primitive part of the brain, that the neomammalian brain, the limbic system. It taps right into our most primitive side, hunger, grasping, craving. It is considered the very root of suffering in both the yogic and the Buddhist traditions. And if you dig deeply, you'll find it everywhere else in all the wisdom traditions. So grasping has two forms, as I've said, reaching. And the second form of grasping is called protecting. That is, I have my big career as a writer. I have to protect it. That is also a root of suffering. Let me give you some examples. So you may remember that, no, you're not old enough, I'm sure, but there was a great figure skater named Michelle Kwan.
Oh, yeah.
Who won the gold medal at the Olympics, and she was a fantastic artist and masterful. And there was this great Dharma moment when she was going back to the Olympics to defend her gold medal. And all of the press was about how she was defending her medal, and you could just feel the tension and the pressure of defending something that she already had. And then along comes this upstart whose name I think was Sarah Brady. And all of the interviews with her were fascinating because this young upstart is saying, well, I have nothing to defend. I'm just going to go out there and enjoy myself. And of course, who won? Sarah Brady went out, enjoyed herself, was completely in the moment. She wasn't in some other moment like, how is this going to come out? Whereas Michelle Kwan stumbled and lost. So the central issue here is that grasping itself, the limbic system, the primitive nature of grasping so disturbs the mind that it takes the mind out of the moment of execution of your task or your dharma into another moment. And I teach this I teach some of the greatest young musicians in the world during the summers. And all of them struggle with this. Like, well, if I don't grasp, if I don't crave for the best outcome, how am I going to achieve it? Well, the contemplative traditions had a completely different view of this. They taught something called aspiration. And aspiration has a minimum of grasping in it. What it has is a very craftsman-like attitude where day by day you begin to master your task, you begin to master your skill, master your dharma. This is in the book I described this as deliberate practice. And there are 8 or 10 different stages or components of deliberate practice, but none of them involve grasping and clinging. They involve a very craftsman-like focus on improving your mastery of your craft or your skill or your dharma. You make sure to get feedback because it all requires feedback loops of great intensity. You work every day just a little by little to move the marbles forward. And eventually you rely on your skill and not on your emotional state of grasping. So those are two very different ways of focusing our motivation: grasping, craving, clinging, or aspiration. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. Aspiration is internal. It's how can I get better? How can I contribute more? How can I bring others up with me as we both try to achieve a goal, whereas grasping is more defensive and protective is the word that you used. Grasping has a negative connotation the way you've described it, versus aspirational has more of a approach to mankind. Am I way over the line here?
No, not at all, Cam. Because grasping, again, narrows our view. It's like that obsession we talked about with I, me, and mine.
Yeah.
When we're caught up in a state of grasping, our view of the world, our perspective becomes narrowed and focused and smaller and all about me. And when we let go of grasping and allow life to flow, that perspective becomes much more vast. And that's when we begin to see how we're interacting with the entire world.
There's a notion of when we're in it, when we found it. We talked about this on the radio portion of this conversation, that things will get easy. But I've got your book in my hand here. I've opened it up to page 100. Perfect. It reads, as the inner life of the practitioner of Dharma becomes more complex, the outer life becomes more simple. So again, the complexity and the struggle exists, but the external struggle seems to fall away, according to what I'm reading here, if I'm understanding it correctly. Can you comment on that?
That's absolutely right. It's very much like psychoanalysis, where it's well known that when you begin to focus your energies on a task, in the case of psychoanalysis, it's in the analytic process, a lot of the external drama of life falls away. So I'll give you an example. I just finished my 6th book. Oh my God, it's been a process that required me to dive so deep and to work so hard day and night. And we talked about aspiration. Why did I do it? Because I aspire to translate this genius of a document, the Gita, into the frame of the needs of the time that people can really use. I wanted to do that. I aspired to do that. And it forced me to dig so deeply. It's just like Whitman was forced to dig so deeply during his years as a soldier's missionary, and to find at the core of himself this treasure trove of heart and of poetry. But no, make no mistake, Dharma does not mean that you will not suffer. What it means is that you will suffer more fruitfully for the world.
Interesting. Golly, keep going.
Yeah, what it means is that your suffering will be aimed in a place that can be most productive for you. And if it's most productive for you, it will be most productive for the world.
Let me read something. Rather, go into the heart of the difficulty, experience it, investigate it, take yourself to the center of the conflict, learn to tolerate its discomfort without acting or reacting. Do you know who wrote that, Stephen?
It sounds like me.
It sounds like you. It is you. It is you. Yeah. And it's wonderful to be reminded that even though you may have found it, it's not always easy. So I know we're on the podcast time here, but I don't want to keep you forever. What are the most surprising takeaways that you see from people like me, right? You're into this. You live it and breathe it. You study it. You've written 6 books. This is a part of who you are. I'm an external guy who's just found this. And when you find people like me, or the people who are listening right now who may have been exposed to this, what do you think their most surprising takeaways from this discovery?
Well, I think that the takeaway is very often that reading my book or talking about this topic gives people permission to begin to notice what those deep messages are that are coming from what Christians call the still small voice, what the contemplative traditions call awake mind or enlightened mind, to listen to that and to take it seriously. And that's a shift in perspective that I found to be incredibly fruitful. What's lighting you up? Pay attention to that on a daily basis. What TV programs are you watching? What characters in the movies do you identify with? What brings you joy and happiness? Like right now, I'll give you an example. All of a sudden, there's a new puppy in my life, and I am completely besotted with this puppy, and it's opened a completely new door. But because I believe in Dharma, I'm going to go through that door, and I'm following it all the way to the end. Maybe my next book will be about dogs. I don't know. But there's something that's lit me up here. And when you experience something in life that lights you up, that brings you joy and that fascinates you, you have to go there, because that, whatever that is, it's something about you that you need to find out.
So about 5 years ago, I asked myself the question, Cam, what would you do if you could do what you want to do versus what you feel like you should be doing?
Yeah.
And I have been, since my career began 20 some odd years ago, filled my days with things that I thought I should be doing, things that would grow the business, take care of my family, etc. And I allowed myself to explore that question of what I would do if I wanted to do it. And two things came out of it. One of them is this radio show. I've always loved a good interview. And the question is, could I do it? Am I capable of it? I want to explore whether I can do this or not.
Yeah.
We're in our 4th year, nearing our 200th episode, and I absolutely love with this that I do here. Is it making money? I'm not doing it for the fruits for sure. It's much like writing a book. I'm not doing it for the fruits. I tell my friends, the profits from the radio show allow me to take my wife to Applebee's one day a month. We can get a beer before dinner or a dessert after dinner, but not both. And we have to split them. That's the profits of the show. So I do it because it's a love. And the second thing is these commentaries that I do that are broadcast on public radio here in the state of Alabama on Alabama Public Radio. And they're 3-minute little insightful, humorous things that I love that have turned into videos that I'm now selling into the corporate marketplace that are designed to enhance the culture of the workplace. And these are all little things that have happened when I allowed myself to ask the question, what would I choose to do versus what do I feel like I have to do? And it's led to a whole new outlook that I have thoroughly enjoyed the exploration of. And you, through your book and this conversation, have told me essentially, you're not way off base. You're doing the right thing by asking these questions. It's wonderful.
Cam, you're the perfect example of this work. You listened to that voice and you acted on it. And that's key, because something happens when we actually take action in service of our Dharma. I write a lot about this in the book. When we actually take action in service of our Dharma, there are all these mystic forces that conspire to support us. I know some people may not like the word mystic, but they're inexplicable, but they're absolutely true. I mean, as soon as I started taking action on my writing career, which, by the way, didn't happen until I was 45.
Yeah, good.
Everything started working out. And no, I haven't become rich, but I've become full. And full is much better than rich. Rich is the booby prize, right? It's not the real prize. The real prize is full with the satisfaction of having served your Dharma and served the world. And that's what you're doing, Cam. And I can feel it, by the way, because there are absolutely two different kinds of interviewers, and I can feel it. And I usually intuitively end up with the ones like you who are already alive to these questions. But there's another more deadly version that I can tell as soon as we start that it's not going to work.
Oh, really? Well, when the new book comes out in December, folks that are listening to the podcast, I promise in my social media world, I'll blow up my social media world with the announcement of your new book, Stephen, and let those that have been enjoying this conversation know that it's available and they can flock through it. And maybe you can go to Applebee's this month.
I would love to. In fact, I'll buy the beer.
There you go. I would love it. Stephen, what a treat. Thank you so much for the extra time for the podcast.
Thanks, Cam. My pleasure entirely. I'll look you up when I'm down there in Alabama.
Which is all the time.
And by the way, my new book has a whole chapter on Alabama.
Does it really?
It does, yeah.
Now
I'll let you and your readers find it in December.
You have piqued my interest of what about the state of Alabama could have been a reaction to difficult times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. There's a cliffhanger. That was beautifully done,
That's
Stephen. It's beautifully done.
Thanks, Cam.
Thank you. Take care.
My pleasure. Bye.
You're listening to What's Working, the extended podcast version. We'll have another show next week, everybody.